Your Imperial Highness, I just want to eat. The last thing Kim Jisoo remembered before dying was this: a half-eaten cup of ramen, cooling on his desk, and the opening chapter of a Danmei novel on his phone screen. The first thing he remembered after waking up was the fact that he was apparently now inside that novel wearing silk, surrounded by eunuchs, and seated in front of a mirror that showed him the face of the imperial noble consort, the most beautiful and most pitiably ignored man in the entire Tianlong Empire. He stared at his reflection for a long time. Then he said very calmly, "Okay, but does the kitchen close?" Chapters 1, in which our hero arrives and immediately asks about the menu. The novel was called Thorns of the Dragon Throne, and it was, by any objective measure, absolutely unhinged. Kim Jisoo had been reading it for 3 weeks. He'd found it at 2 in the morning through a recommendation thread titled BL Novels That Will Ruin Your Life, Affectionate, and had made the catastrophic decision to click. 3 weeks, 42 chapters, and approximately 11 crying sessions later, he had known the plot better than the author probably did. The premise: Emperor Long Ziyuan, cold and brilliant and emotionally destroyed by years of court intrigue, ruled the Tianlong Empire with the precision of a man who had decided that feelings were for lesser beings. He had a harem of consorts he never visited, enemies in every shadow, and an ancestral sword that had not been drawn in 20 years. The plot followed his slow, agonizing, deeply satisfying fall into love with a fictional court official named Wei Shufeng, who was brave and idealistic, and kept yelling at the emperor in a way that should have resulted in immediate execution, but somehow resulted in passionate kissing instead. The imperial noble consort, the role Jisoo had apparently now inherited, was a background character named Shen Yuming. Beautiful, melancholy, and completely irrelevant to the main plot, mentioned in perhaps 5 chapters. Famous within the harem for being the consort the emperor had personally selected at the grand consort selection, brought to the palace with great ceremony, and then never visited once in 2 years. Not once, not a single time. Shen Yuming had been installed in the Liking Palace, the most beautiful residential palace in the imperial complex, second only to the emperor's own Qianlong Hall, and then essentially forgotten about. In the novel, Shen Yuming was described as quietly heartbroken. He pined. He wrote poetry about the moon. He watched the emperor's palanquin pass in the distance and pressed his sleeve to his lips in silent longing. Kim Jisoo read back over these passages in his memory and felt absolutely nothing in common with this description. He looked around the Liking Palace. He took in the carved rosewood furniture, the silk hangings in colors he didn't have names for, the bronze incense burners shaped like mythical creatures gently releasing curling smoke that smelled like sandalwood and something floral, the paper windows painted with winter plum blossoms, and the small army of attendants standing at careful attention along the walls, all of them watching him with varying degrees of nervous uncertainty, because apparently the imperial noble consort had collapsed without warning an hour ago, and had now woken up looking at his own hands like he'd never seen hands before. System notification. Congratulations. You have been transmigrated into the novel Thorns of the Dragon Throne as the imperial noble consort, Shen Yuming. Current objective, none assigned. Current status, alive, fed, housed, extremely well-dressed. Note, the original host's soul has peacefully departed. You may proceed as you see fit. Jisoo stared at the floating, translucent text that only he could see, hovering in the air to his right like a bored celestial notification. He had expected something like this. He'd read enough transmigration novels. He waited. The system said nothing else. "That's it," he said aloud in Korean, and then caught himself and switched to the Mandarin that his borrowed body apparently knew how to speak. "There's no mission, no golden finger, no become the Emperor's one true love and unlock hidden achievements." The system flickered. System notification. You are a background character. The main plot does not concern you. Do whatever you want. Kim Jisoo sat with this information for a moment. Then slowly, a smile spread across his face. He looked at the attendants. He looked at the palace. He looked at the incense smoke and the silk and the immaculate tray of untouched food that had apparently been placed before him before his collapse and forgotten about in the panic. "You," he said, pointing to the nearest attendant, a young boy with a round face who looked genuinely terrified. "What's your name?" This servant is called Zairaba, your highness, the boy squeaked. Zairaba, great. Can someone please explain to me what's on this tray and whether there's more of it available? And also I'd like to know what time meals are served and whether there are snacks available between meals. And he paused, studying the room with the eyes of a man doing rapid calculations. Do I have a garden? The attendants exchanged looks of profound confusion. Your highness has the liking garden, Zairabai offered carefully. With the moon pavilion, where your highness often goes to write poetry and contemplate. Excellent, said Jisoo. Can I put a hammock in it? Silence. What, your highness? Jisoo made a rough gesture indicating a structure suspended between two trees. A hanging bed, woven from rope or silk or whatever's available, so I can lie in the garden and look at the sky. More silence. Then Zairabai, in the voice of someone unsure whether this was a test or a command, said, This servant will inquire with the head chamberlain, your highness. Perfect, said Jisoo. He picked up a piece of osmanthus cake from the forgotten tray and bit into it, and the flavor hit him like a small, exquisite thunderbolt. His eyes went wide. He looked at the cake. He looked at Zairabai. Is there more of this? There is an entire kitchen, your highness. Kim Jisoo, 24 years old, a graduate student in his previous life who had survived on convenience store ramen and the occasional fried chicken delivery. A man who had never once been waited on by anyone, and who now apparently resided in a palace with a dedicated kitchen, a garden, and an entire staff of attendants with no emperor to answer to, felt something warm and profound settle in his chest. This, he thought, is fine. Chapter 2. The luxurious tragedy of being forgotten. Convenient, actually. Within a week, Kim Jisoo had reorganized his entire existence. The original Shen Yuming had lived in the Liking Palace like a man waiting to be remembered. The chambers were beautiful but severe, minimal decoration, very little color, everything arranged in a way that suggested a person who was holding themselves in readiness for something that never came. The poetry brushes were always clean. The zither was always tuned. The guest chambers were kept prepared. Jisoo took one look at this and thought, this is a man who has been staging himself for an audience for 2 years. There is no audience. The show is cancelled. Time to actually live here. He asked for more rugs. He got rugs. Thick ones, Xinjiang patterned, spread across the cold stone floors so that walking around barefoot, which he preferred, was no longer an event in suffering. He asked for the stiff formal furniture to be rearranged, pushing the reading couch closer to the window that caught afternoon sun, and relocating the writing desk to the corner because he was not, personally, planning to write poetry on it, and it was taking up the best reading light. He filled every available surface with things he liked. Potted chrysanthemums from the Liking garden, a collection of interesting rocks he'd found near the pond, a truly excessive number of reference books about Tianlong's history and botany and cuisine, because if he was going to live here, he wanted to actually understand where here was. He asked the kitchen to send him a different dish every morning that he'd never tried before. This request had initially caused head chef Wu to sit down suddenly in the middle of his own kitchen, overcome. The previous Shen Yuming had eaten like a man who considered food to be a minor inconvenience. Jisoo ate like someone experiencing a religious conversion at every meal. He learned within 2 weeks that the Liking Palace had its own small herb garden attached to the back courtyard that had been mostly neglected, because no one had seemed to care. He cared. He spent 3 mornings with the head gardener, a weathered man named Old Feng who had been tending the imperial gardens for 30 years, and who looked at the noble consort getting down on his knees to peer at a wilting mint plant with an expression of holy bewilderment, redesigning the whole thing. Within a month, it was producing fresh herbs that made their way into the kitchen, which made the food even better, which made Jisoo even happier, which made everyone in the Liking Palace look at each other and silently acknowledge that something fundamentally different was happening with their lord. The hammock arrived on the 9th day. It had taken the head chamberlain, a fastidious man named Steward Liu who seemed personally affronted by the concept. 6 attempts to design something that met both the functional requirements, hang between trees, support a person, not collapse, and the aesthetic standards of an imperial palace. The final result was woven from midnight blue silk rope and trimmed with small jade ornaments, and it was genuinely the most beautiful hammock Jisoo had ever seen. He lay in it every afternoon when the weather permitted, surrounded by plum blossom or chrysanthemum or whatever the season had on offer, staring up at the sky and eating whatever small snack Ziobai had brought him, and felt a bone-deep peace that he suspected he had never actually experienced in his entire previous life. "Your Highness is not sad today?" Ziobai asked one afternoon, hovering at the edge of the hammock's reach, holding a small plate of candied lotus seeds. "Why would I be sad?" "His Majesty has not." Ziobai hesitated, plainly terrified to finish the sentence. "Visited? No, he hasn't." Jisoo accepted a lotus seed and popped it into his mouth. The sweetness bloomed across his tongue. "I'm aware." "Your Highness is not bothered?" Jisoo considered the question with genuine thoughtfulness, staring up through the lattice of plum branches at the white winter sky. From somewhere on the other side of the palace wall, he could hear the faint sounds of the imperial city going about its enormous and complicated business. In the Liking Palace, there was only the sound of wind, and the creak of the hammock's jade ornaments, and Zayabai's anxious breathing. "Zayabai," he said, "I have a private palace, a dedicated kitchen, a garden, a hammock, and no one has asked me to do anything in 16 days. What would I possibly be bothered about?" Zayabai stared at him. "The previous Shen Yumming cried quite a lot, Your Highness," Zayarabai said in a small voice. "The previous Shen Yumming," said Jisoo with perfect gentleness, "had different priorities." Within the harem, there was a great deal of drama happening that Jisoo was completely unaware of. He knew it was there in the same way he knew the novel's plot, academically, distantly. The virtuous consort was scheming. The noble lady in the East Wing was weeping. Several of the lower-ranked ladies had formed a factional alliance that involved a lot of meaningful glances in the garden and whispered conversations behind decorative screens. The Emperor's first imperial concubine, a woman named Consort May who had been angling for the position of noble consort before the Emperor had abruptly selected Shen Yumming from the selection ceremony, was reportedly engaged in a quiet but sustained campaign of social warfare against everyone in her vicinity. None of this touched the Liking Palace. This was partly because Jisoo made no moves, attended no gatherings, cultivated no alliances, and issued no challenges. Where the other consorts jostled and maneuvered for visibility and favor, the imperial noble consort was simply absent. Not dramatically absent, not pointedly absent, just quietly living his life in his palace and not going anywhere. The other consorts had initially expected the standard noble consort behavior. The subtle displays of rank, the careful social navigation, the competition for the Emperor's attention. What they got instead was a man who spent his afternoons in a hammock and had recently commissioned a small fish pond to be added to his garden because he found watching fish soothing. Consort May, who had prepared 11 separate strategies for dealing with Shen Yumming's potential aggression, found herself with nothing to deploy. She sent a spy. The spy reported back that the imperial noble consort had spent the morning identifying medicinal herbs, with a gardener, eaten lunch with what sounded like genuine enthusiasm, and was currently lying in a silk hammock eating osmanthus cake and reading what appeared to be a historical geography text. Consort May sat with this for a long moment. "Is he plotting something?" she asked. The spy said nothing for a moment, with the expression of a person who was wondering the same thing. "This servant does not believe so, my lady." "Everyone is plotting something." The noble consort asked the kitchen to try making a dish with the chrysanthemum petals from his garden, the spy offered. And then he spent 20 minutes debating with the chef about the best technique. Consort May dismissed the spy and sat alone for quite a long time, deeply unsettled in a way she could not articulate. Chapter 3. The Emperor does not know what to do with this. Emperor Long Ziyuan received reports about everything. This was not vanity or paranoia, or rather, it was both of those things, but it was also simple governance. The Tianlong Empire was vast and complicated and full of people who wanted things, and the only way to stay alive at the center of it was to know, at all times, what everyone around you was doing and why. He had a network of informants that spanned from the highest ministers of court to the palace kitchen boys. Nothing happened in the imperial complex without eventually making its way to his desk. He received the first report about the imperial noble consort during the 3rd week of the first month of his reign's 12th year, buried in a routine palace report between a note about a minor repair needed in the east corridor and a record of supplies delivered to the kitchen. The imperial noble consort Shen Yuming has requested modifications to the Liking Garden. A suspended sleeping apparatus has been installed. The consort also requested 12 additional volumes from the Imperial Library on the subjects of botany, historical geography, and cookery. Long Ziyuan read this once. Then he read it again. He had selected Shen Yuming at the consort selection ceremony because the man's face had stopped him cold, a kind of beauty that was almost hostile in its perfection, like a painted screen that you were afraid to stand too close to in case you marked it somehow. He'd installed him in the Liking Palace, the best residential palace in the complex, as an acknowledgement of this. He had intended to visit. He had not visited. Court had been consuming, the northern campaigns had required his attention, and the matter of the Prime Minister's faction had developed in ways that demanded every spare hour of thought. 2 years had passed. He acknowledged to himself, essentially forgotten about the noble consort entirely, in the way that you forgot about a beautiful object in a room you didn't often enter. He was obscurely waiting for a sign that this had caused some kind of damage. For tears, for petitions, for the pointed silence that beautiful, neglected things eventually produced when they decided to make themselves noticed. He had seen it before, the consorts who transformed abandonment into theater, who made forgetting them into an event. 12 volumes on botany, historical geography, and cookery. A suspended sleeping apparatus. Long Ziyuan set the report down. He picked it up again. He handed it to his personal attendant, Chief Eunuch Tan, and said, "What is a suspended sleeping apparatus?" Chief Eunuch Tan described a hammock. Long Ziyuan looked at the window for a moment. "Continue monitoring," he said, and returned to his paperwork. The reports continued. Each one was individually unremarkable. In aggregate, they produced a portrait that Long Ziyuan found increasingly difficult to set aside. The noble consort was redesigning his garden. The noble consort was working with the palace chef to develop new recipes. The noble consort had learned to play Weiqi from Steward Liu, who had apparently found himself challenged to a game he couldn't easily refuse, and was now reportedly spending several evenings a week losing to the consort, which had done something remarkable to Steward Liu's general disposition. He smiled now occasionally when discussing the noble consort, in the way of a man who had been surprised into fondness. The noble consort had taken to long walking circuits of the Liking Palace's outer courtyard in the mornings, apparently for the simple pleasure of moving through cold air, which was the kind of thing that Long Ziyuan himself did at 6 in the morning before court sessions, and which he had never considered might also occur to a harem consort. He sent, through appropriate channels, an inquiry about whether the noble consort required anything. The response that came back, filtered through appropriate channels in the opposite direction, was, "His Highness the noble consort thanks His Majesty for the inquiry and notes that everything is very comfortable. His Highness would, however, appreciate it if the Imperial Library's culinary collection could be expanded to include works from the southern provinces, as the current collection is somewhat sparse on that region." Long Ziyuan read this message 3 times. He turned to Chief Eunuch Tan. "He wants cookbooks," he said, in the tone of a man experiencing a novel sensation. "It appears so, Your Majesty." "He is not asking for," Long Ziyuan gestured vaguely, indicating the full range of things neglected consorts typically asked for. "A visit, an audience, some acknowledgement of existence beyond the routine supply reports." "He is asking for cookbooks, Your Majesty." Long Ziyuan sent the cookbooks, all of them. He had the Imperial Library compile a complete collection of culinary texts from every province, including several rare manuscripts that had not been widely circulated, and sent them to the Liking Palace with a formal note that said, "A gift from His Imperial Majesty." The response, when it came, was so warm and so genuine, and so thoroughly lacking in any strategic calculation whatsoever that Long Ziyuan actually put it down on his desk, and stood up and walked to the window and stood there for a moment. "His Highness the noble consort is deeply moved by His Majesty's generosity and thanks him from the bottom of his heart. The southern provincial texts are exactly what was needed. His Highness will study them carefully. He has also, in a spirit of gratitude, asked the kitchen to prepare a dish from the texts, and humbly requests that it be sent to His Majesty's table tonight for His Majesty to try, if His Majesty is so inclined." That night at Long Ziyuan's dinner table, an unfamiliar dish arrived. A slow-braised fish with caramelized aromatics and a sauce that had been built from ingredients he recognized, but in a combination he had never encountered. He ate it. He ate all of it. He sent the empty bowl back. He sat for a long time in his study afterward. "Tan," he said. "Your Majesty, what does the noble consort look like these days?" Chief Eunuch Tan paused with the precision of a man choosing his words very carefully. "This servant has heard from the Liking Palace staff that His Highness appears. Well, Your Majesty, healthy, in good spirits. Not unhappy." The pause this time was almost imperceptible. "By all accounts, Your Majesty, not unhappy at all." Long Ziyuan was, he realized, in completely uncharted territory. He had expected the noble consort to either cause problems or quietly suffer. He had prepared responses for both scenarios. He had no prepared response for a noble consort who was apparently thriving on palace cuisine and garden maintenance and was sending fish to his table. He picked up a memorial from his desk. He put it down again. "Send him the imperial physician for a routine check tomorrow," he said, because it was normal protocol, and he was a man who liked normal protocol, and he was absolutely not using it as an excuse to get a more detailed report on the state of the noble consort's well-being. Chief Eunuch Tan said, "Yes, Your Majesty," with an inflection of precisely 0 degrees of speculation, which Long Ziyuan appreciated. Chapter 4, in which the imperial noble consort commits the crime of being content. The imperial physician was a meticulous elderly man named Dr. Zheng, who had been treating the imperial household for 40 years, and who had, in that time, developed strong opinions about the psychological well-being of palace consorts. His strong opinion, honed over 4 decades, was that palace consorts were not well. They were beautiful and miserable on average in varying proportions. The ones with power were anxious. The ones without power were depressed. The ones in the middle were both. He had dispensed more medicine for insomnia, digestive troubles, and the kind of vague but persistent malaise that had no clean diagnosis than he could count. He arrived at the Liking Palace prepared for all of this. The noble consort was in the garden when he arrived, sitting on a low stool next to the new fish pond, doing absolutely nothing except watching the fish. Not meditating, not composing poetry, not performing any of the elegant activities that court beauty traditionally required. Just watching the fish with an expression of simple, unguarded pleasure. He looked up when Dr. Zheng was announced, and smiled, not the careful, composed, jewel-bright smile that Dr. Zheng was accustomed to seeing on faces in the harem, but the ordinary smile of a person who was glad to see someone. "Dr. Zheng, I've been hoping for a chance to ask you something." "Your Highness, I've been reading about medicinal plants, and I'm not sure if the herb in the back garden is actually white atractylodes or mountain yam. They look very similar at this stage, and Old Feng isn't certain either. I don't want to use it in cooking if it's the wrong one. Can you tell?" Dr. Zheng performed the routine examination. The noble consort was in excellent health. His sleep was good. His digestion was good. His constitution, which had reportedly been somewhat delicate under the previous regime of the same person, Dr. Zheng corrected himself internally, had stabilized considerably. He asked about the usual complaints. There were none. "No trouble sleeping, Your Highness." "I sleep very well, actually. The garden is very quiet at night." "No loss of appetite?" Jisoo laughed, an actual laugh, spontaneous and a little undignified, which Dr. Zheng blinked at. "Absolutely not." "No persistent melancholy? No periods of weeping or despondency?" "No," Jisoo tilted his head, watching Dr. Zheng's expression. "You expected some, didn't you?" Dr. Zheng cleared his throat. "It is not uncommon, Your Highness, given the circumstances. The circumstances being that I live in an extremely comfortable palace, eat excellent food, have a beautiful garden, and no one makes demands on my time," said Jisoo pleasantly. "I am aware of the circumstances. I'm quite fond of them." Dr. Zheng wrote in his report, "The noble consort Shen Yuming is in excellent physical health and presents no signs of psychological distress. He is, by this physician's assessment, the most contented person in the imperial harem and possibly the imperial complex. No treatment indicated." He added a footnote. "The herb in the back garden is white atractylodes, suitable for culinary use." Meanwhile, in the main part of the imperial complex, life was happening with considerable intensity. The emperor was conducting the politics of empire, which involved navigating the prime minister's faction, suppressing a minor border skirmish in the northwest, managing the tax reform that 3 different ministers were convinced would either save or destroy the empire depending on who you asked, and doing all of this while maintaining the appearance of absolute and effortless authority, because the moment an emperor appeared to be struggling, the wolves in court robes began circling. In the middle of all this, Long Ziyuan found himself thinking about the noble consort more often than was strictly rational. Not obsessively, not in a way that interfered with his work, just intermittently. Like a puzzle he kept returning to, the fish dish had been followed 3 days later by a packet of dried chrysanthemum tea from the Liking garden with a note explaining its health benefits in a tone so earnest it had briefly silenced Long Ziyuan's entire thought process. Then a small painting from the garden, not a particularly skilled painting, not at all the kind of refined art that court culture demanded of its consorts, but a genuine and charming study of the fish pond that somehow conveyed exactly the quality of light in a winter afternoon, that had ended up propped against the wall of his study. He hadn't moved it. He wasn't sure why he hadn't moved it. He moved things all the time. His study was orderly by design, everything placed with purpose. The painting was a little crooked and slightly amateurish, and he had left it exactly where it was for 6 weeks. The noble consort painted this himself, he'd asked Tan. Apparently so, Your Majesty. He told the messenger that it was nothing much, just a small thing, and please not to trouble Your Majesty with it if Your Majesty is busy. Please not to trouble me with it. Long Ziyuan had stared at the painting for a long time. The fish in it were extremely round and probably not anatomically accurate. He was unreasonably charmed by them. Chapter 5. The spy report that changed everything. It was Consort May's spy network that produced the incident report that circulated through the harem like wildfire in a dry forest. The report was simple. The noble consort had been overheard singing in his garden. This was not, on its surface, particularly remarkable. Consort sang. It was a standard accomplishment. Consort May herself played the chin beautifully and sang in a way that had been compared to evening birdsong by 3 separate poets of note. The noble consort Shen Yuming, apparently, sang the kind of songs that nobody in the Tianlong Empire had heard before. Songs that were, by the account of everyone who'd heard them through the garden wall, simultaneously very simple in structure and completely incomprehensible in their references. Songs about someone being unable to stop loving despite knowing better. Songs with chorus structures that repeated in a way that was sort of hypnotic. Songs that the palace kitchen staff had been overheard humming by the end of the week without seeming to know where they'd picked up the melody. The words made no sense. I don't want to be your friend, I want to kiss your lips, which, in the Tianlong Empire, where court poetry operated on a register of elaborate metaphor and accumulated classical illusion, landed like a tile falling off a roof onto a very quiet courtyard. Direct, peculiar, strangely compelling. By the 3rd week, 3 palace maids had been overheard humming what kitchen staff were calling the noble consort's strange song. By the 4th week, it had made it to the guards of the outer gate, who hummed it while standing watch, though none of them could have said where they'd first heard it. Long Ziyuan heard it from Chief Eunuch Tan, who had heard it from the head of the Imperial Guard, who had heard it from one of the gate guards, who had heard it from a kitchen maid, who had heard it from Xiaobai, who had simply been present in the garden too many times when his master was singing, and had absorbed the melody without noticing. Long Ziyuan's brushwork paused on the memorial he was annotating. He was just singing in the garden. While tending the herb beds, Your Majesty, he apparently sings while he works. The staff reports he's quite cheerful about it. Long Ziyuan set down his brush. He picked it up again. He set it down again. Clear my schedule tomorrow afternoon, he said. Chief Eunuch Tan blinked once, in what was, for him, the equivalent of a dramatic double-take. Your Majesty's afternoon is occupied with the Ministry of Revenue's 2nd quarter summary presentation. Reschedule it. Yes, Your Majesty. I'm going to visit the Liking Palace. Another barely perceptible pause. This servant will make the arrangements. Quietly. Of course, Your Majesty. Long Ziyuan returned to his memorial. He annotated it. He reviewed a border map. He read 3 policy documents. He was perfectly focused and productive for the remainder of the afternoon. He hummed at one point, a fragment of a melody he had apparently absorbed without realizing it, then stopped immediately and sat very still for a moment before continuing with his work. Chapter 6. His Imperial Majesty has questions. The problem with Long Ziyuan's decision to visit the Liking Palace quietly was that there was no truly quiet way for the Emperor of the Tianlong Empire to go anywhere. His minimum necessary entourage, stripped down to the essentials, still consisted of Chief Eunuch Tan, 4 Imperial Guards, 2 lesser attendants, a documentation official whose job was to record any and all Imperial decisions made during the visit, and a protocol officer whose job was to ensure that correct procedure was observed at every step. They moved through the palace complex in a formation that even the least politically observant palace maid would recognize as His Imperial Majesty going somewhere, and the news spread ahead of them like a stone dropped in still water. It arrived at the Liking Palace approximately 4 minutes before Long Ziyuan did. In those 4 minutes, the Liking Palace underwent a transformation that would have impressed military commanders. Steward Liu materialized from somewhere, instantly composed, directing with precise gestures. Every attendant who had been lounging comfortably in the informal atmosphere Jisoo had cultivated over 3 months snapped to attention with the speed of people who had not forgotten their training even when their lord had stopped requiring it. Incense was lit. Flower arrangements were adjusted. A ceremonial tea service appeared on the main receiving room table as if it had always been there. The only person who did not immediately perform a transformation was Jisoo, because by the time Zaya sprinted to the garden to find him, Jisoo had just settled into his hammock with a bowl of roasted pine nuts and a book about the ancient water management systems of the southern provinces, and he took approximately 45 seconds longer than was ideal to fully process the information being delivered to him. His Majesty is coming here. Is here, Your Highness, entering the outer gate now. Jisoo got out of the hammock. He looked down at himself. He was wearing comfortable, informal robes of pale green that were, by the standards of everything he owned, relatively underdressed for an imperial visit. He'd specifically ordered less formal inner palace clothing, because he'd found the full court robes uncomfortable for day-to-day existence. His hair was mostly up, but not with the full formal ornaments. He had roughly 90 seconds, by his calculation. He handed the pine nuts to Zayarabai. He straightened his robes. He did what he could with his hair in the time available, which was to say he made it symmetrical and hoped the Emperor was not the kind of man who noticed such things. Long Ziyuan was absolutely the kind of man who noticed such things. He went to the receiving room. Long Ziyuan had a memory that functioned like a precise mechanism. He forgot almost nothing, filed everything, and could retrieve information at will with accuracy that sometimes unnerved his ministers. He had not forgotten what Shen Yuming looked like. He had a clear image of the consort from the selection ceremony 2 years ago, composed, still, immaculate, with the quality of beauty that existed in absolute stillness, like a painted portrait. The person who came into the receiving room was recognizably the same person. Same face, same eyes, extraordinary bone structure that 2 years in a palace garden had, if anything, polished slightly. There was color in his face from outdoor time, and the tension that Long Ziyuan remembered from the selection ceremony had simply gone, replaced by something relaxed and present and very slightly flustered. The robes were informal. His hair was neat but lacked the full ceremonial ornaments. There was, Long Ziyuan noticed with something he refused to identify, a small ink mark on the index finger of his left hand, which suggested he had been writing or reading something recently. Shen Yuming completed his obeisance and rose. Their eyes met. Long Ziyuan had the experience of looking at a person who was genuinely unsure what the protocol was for this situation, and was choosing, in the absence of guidance, to default to gracious calm. Your Majesty honors this humble palace with his presence, the noble consort said. His voice was steady and slightly warmer than Long Ziyuan had expected. Please be seated. They sat, tea was poured. There was a silence that was, on Long Ziyuan's side, the silence of a man who had cleared his afternoon schedule on an impulse, and was now sitting in the receiving room of his own harem consort, and could not quite remember what he had planned to say. He had not, he realized, planned anything to say. He had simply come. How are you finding the Liking Palace? he asked, which was not brilliant but was a start. Very comfortable, thank you. The gardener is excellent and the kitchen has been extremely accommodating. The kitchen? Head chef Wu has been very patient with my experiments, Jisoo said. I've been trying to recreate a dish from the southern provincial text Your Majesty sent, the steamed fish with sheoxing wine. The technique is finicky. Long Ziyuan, who had not had a conversation about cooking since approximately age 7, felt his carefully maintained imperial composure encounter something it had not previously encountered. Genuine curiosity. You cook. I advise Chef Wu won't actually let me touch the knives. A very brief, very small smile, self-deprecating in a way that was unexpectedly disarming. He's protective of his kitchen, but he lets me suggest things. The fish dish you sent, Long Ziyuan said. Last month, that was an experiment. The fourth attempt. The first 3 were good but not right. The fourth one, Jisoo paused, and his expression did something quite unguarded and completely involuntary, a kind of gleam of satisfaction that lasted only a moment before he composed himself. I was happy with the fourth. So was I, said Long Ziyuan. He had not intended to say that. It was true, which was why he'd said it, but he had not intended to say it. Shen Yuming looked at him, a direct, unaffected look that Long Ziyuan was not accustomed to receiving from anyone, and seemed genuinely pleased. Not calculating, not strategic, just pleased. I'm very glad, he said simply. Long Ziyuan drank his tea. He looked around the receiving room and noticed, for the first time, the small things that had changed it from the formal receiving space he'd authorized into something that felt inhabited. Lived in. The books on the side table, the small painting of the fish pond on the wall, a pottery vase with what appeared to be herbs rather than the traditional flowers, everything arranged with the same sensibility, comfortable, genuine, and not at all what the setting was supposed to contain. You painted that, he said, looking at the fish pond painting. Ah, a flash of genuine embarrassment. I should have put it somewhere less visible before. Yes, that's mine. It's not very good. I have the other one, said Long Ziyuan before he could stop himself. The one you sent in my study. The silence that followed was very brief and very loud. You kept it, said Shen Yuming, in the voice of a man who had sent a small amateur painting to the emperor as an afterthought, and had genuinely not expected it to make it past the palace supply records, let alone into the emperor's study. It's there, said Long Ziyuan. He was aware that this was not technically an answer to the question. The fish are well rendered. The fish were comically round and not well rendered by any conventional measure. They both knew this. Shen Yuming's expression cycled through several things very quickly, surprise, amusement barely held, something warmer, and landed on a smile that Long Ziyuan felt obscurely somewhere in the vicinity of his sternum. I'll paint better ones, Shen Yuming said. When the pond fish have grown a bit more, they're still small. I'll look forward to them, said Long Ziyuan. Chapter 7. The Great Plum Blossom Garden Incident. Long Ziyuan visited the Liking Palace again the following week. He told himself, a reason. He wanted to see the herb garden that had produced the chrysanthemum tea. This was a legitimate reason. It was not at all an excuse. He was the emperor, he didn't need excuses to go anywhere in the palace, but if he had been constructing one, it would have been this. The Liking Garden in late winter was in the early stages of plum blossom season, and the air was very cold, and carried that particular mineral freshness that arrived before snow. Shen Yuming was in the garden when Long Ziyuan arrived, doing something to a raised herb bed that involved kneeling in a way that was probably not technically appropriate for an imperial noble consort, but which Shen Yuming appeared to be doing without any particular self-consciousness. He stood when he saw Long Ziyuan brushing dirt from his hands with a completely unashamed expression, and said, Your Majesty, the garden is not at its best today. The autumn bed is still dormant, but the plum is about to peak. You're gardening, said Long Ziyuan. I was helping old Feng with the winter mulching. He has a bad knee. You have staff for that? I like it, said Shen Yuming with a simplicity that was, somehow, not a challenge but just a fact. Shall I show your Majesty the herb beds? The white atractylodes has started to come back. They walked through the Liking Garden in the cold afternoon. Long Ziyuan, who had been conducting state tour of landscapes, formal choreographed, the landscape as backdrop to power, since he was old enough to sit a horse, found that a different kind of walk was happening here. Shen Yuming walked through the garden the way a person walks through a place they love, with small detours, with commentary that was genuinely informative and occasionally funny. Stopping to show Long Ziyuan a plum branch that was 3 days from blooming and holding it out the way you would hold something out to a friend, not to demonstrate, but to share. "This one always blooms first," Shen Yuming said, turning the branch gently. "Old Feng says it faces the right direction for morning sun. It's earlier than all the others by at least a week." Long Ziyuan looked at the branch. He looked at the person holding it. The ink mark was still on Shen Yuming's left index finger, which meant it was a permanent feature of his existence and not an anomaly, and for some reason this registered as important information. "You're happy here?" Long Ziyuan said. It was an observation, not a question, and it came out slightly more direct than he had intended. Shen Yuming looked at him, then gently replaced the branch. "Yes," he said, and then, because he was apparently not a person who left things half-stated, "Are you surprised?" Long Ziyuan considered this. "Most people in your position are unhappy," Shen Yuming finished, not unkindly. "I know. I think they're looking for something that requires a specific kind of attention from a specific person." He paused. "I'm not looking for that. I'm looking at the plum trees." Something in Long Ziyuan's chest did a thing he chose not to examine closely. "And the plum trees are sufficient." "The plum trees and the fish and the kitchen and the books and—" Shen Yuming looked at him with a directness that was slightly alarming. "This, actually. This is also nice. This, the walk, the conversation. Long Ziyuan standing in someone else's garden being shown a plum branch. He had not been told something was nice since before he took the throne. He stood in the cold garden for a moment and then did something unprecedented in the history of his reign. He let out a small, brief, genuine laugh. It was quiet. It surprised him. Shen Yuming looked at him with an expression of barely contained delight, like someone who had attempted something and found it worked. "Does your Majesty want to see the fish?" Shen Yuming asked. "Yes," said Long Ziyuan. They went to look at the fish. The fish were small and a deep golden red, and moved through the cold water with the purposeless elegance of things that have no agenda. Long Ziyuan crouched at the edge of the pond, a gesture so entirely unimperial that Chief Eunuch Tan, watching from the pavilion at a diplomatic distance, felt something shift in his understanding of the next several years of his career, and watched them for a while. "They don't have names," Shen Yuming said, crouching beside him. They were very close at this angle. "I keep meaning to name them, but I can never decide." "That one," said Long Ziyuan, pointing to a slightly larger fish moving with what did look, honestly, like leadership. "Looks like a minister." Shen Yuming looked at the fish, then at Long Ziyuan, then pressed his sleeve against his mouth very quickly in the way of a person suppressing something undignified. "Which minister?" "Prime Minister Zhao." Shen Yuming lost the battle and laughed, a real laugh, the undignified kind, and Long Ziyuan watched it happen with something that settled in him like warmth from tea, spreading outward from the center. Chapter 8. In which someone falls and it is not off a horse. The visits became a habit before either of them had consciously decided to make them one. Every 5 to 7 days, Long Ziyuan's schedule developed a gap in the afternoon that Chief Eunuch Tan filled with increasing confidence by preparing the Liking Palace protocol without being asked. Sometimes Long Ziyuan stayed for tea and an hour's conversation. Sometimes he stayed until near dinner, and on 3 occasions the Liking Palace kitchen sent food and they ate in the garden pavilion in the gathering dark, talking about things that ranged from water management policy to the specific personality of the large golden fish who had been named Prime Minister Zhao and had, in the intervening weeks, developed a genuine habit of aggressively crowding other fish away from food. Inside the harem, the effect was seismic. Consort May's 11 strategy response plan was, finally, deployed, though it now required significant revision, since all 11 strategies had been predicated on the noble consort being a rival in the traditional sense, and what Shen Yuming had turned out to be was something that none of the strategies had accounted for. He didn't compete. He didn't scheme. He was simply present and content and apparently interesting to the emperor in a way that had nothing to do with beauty or political alignment or any of the conventional levers of harem power. The virtuous consort sent a formal visiting note and received a gracious reply and a small package of dried herbs from the Liking garden, which was, She sat with the package for a long time, not what she had expected at all. The noble lady in the East Wing heard the Prime Minister Zhao Fish story secondhand, and laughed so hard she had to sit down, and then was furious at herself for being charmed. Steward Liu, who had been the noble consort's Waiki sparring partner for 3 months and had developed the particular affection of a man who has been consistently, cheerfully outplayed by someone with no formal training, simply watched all of this and thought, yes, obviously, have you met him? The thing that Jisoo had not quite anticipated about this situation, transmigrated background character, quiet life, no plot relevance required, was that it was increasingly difficult to maintain plot irrelevance when the Emperor kept showing up. He had been tracking the novel's plot in his head as a kind of background awareness, a way of knowing what was happening in the broader story he was living inside. Wei Shufeng, the actual main character, was at this point in the novel approximately 6 chapters away from his first direct confrontation with the Emperor, which would result in a shouting match in the throne room that would be talked about at court for decades. The relationship between them was crackling with unresolved tension. The Prime Minister's faction was about to make a significant move. Things were, in the novel, about to get very dramatic. Jisoo was, at this particular moment, sitting in his garden eating dumplings that Chef Wu had made with filling from the herb garden, and feeling extremely peaceful about everything. He was also, he admitted privately, waiting for the sound of footsteps at the garden gate. This was, he recognized, a development. He hadn't been waiting for anything for months. He'd been happy not waiting. And now there was a specific person whose footsteps he had apparently learned to distinguish from all other footsteps in the Imperial complex, which was information about himself that he was sitting with. The gate opened. Long Ziyuan came in, already slightly more relaxed than he arrived anywhere else in the palace, that particular quality of decompression visible in the fractional change in how he held his shoulders, the way the formal imperial face gave itself a small holiday. Dumplings, Jisoo offered, holding out the plate. Long Ziyuan sat beside him on the garden bench, which he had started doing as if it were normal, which it now was, and took a dumpling. What's in them today? Pork and white atractylodes and a lot of ginger. Chef Wu's idea, actually. He said it would be good for the cold weather. Long Ziyuan ate it. His expression did the thing it always did with food Jisoo had had a hand in creating, a moment of genuine, unguarded assessment, followed by something that was simply pleasure. He's right. They ate dumplings in companionable silence as the winter afternoon light went golden over the plum trees. Prime Minister Zhao, the fish, moved regally through the pond. Somewhere in the palace complex, an enormous empire was being administered. Borders were being defended, ministers were arguing, and none of it came through the gate of the Liking Garden unless Long Ziyuan brought it in. He mostly didn't bring it in. You know, Jisoo said, without particularly planning to, when I first came here I thought I was just going to be invisible. Long Ziyuan looked at him. I wasn't expecting company, Jisoo continued, which was one way to put it. I thought I'd read my books and tend my garden and be quiet. And instead, Jisoo thought about it, the fish, the plum trees, Steward Liu's increasingly genuine laughter over Waiki, Old Feng's weathered pride in the herb beds, Chef Wu's face when a dish came together perfectly. And this, the particular quality of this late afternoon, sitting with a man who had brought himself here without obligation, who came back without being asked, who laughed at the fish. Instead it became something else, Jisoo said. Something I didn't plan, which is... He looked at Long Ziyuan and decided on honesty, because honesty was one of the things he'd brought with him and he intended to keep it. Which is actually better. Long Ziyuan was quiet for a moment. The light was very gold. Prime Minister Zhao the fish surfaced and then descended. Yes, said Long Ziyuan, I think so too. Chapter 9. The Imperial Court is not ready. The problem with falling for someone when you are the emperor of a vast empire is that you cannot do it quietly. Long Ziyuan had managed, for a while, to keep the Liking Palace visits in the comfortable ambiguity of routine, regular enough to be a habit, irregular enough to be deniable as a pattern. But at some point, he was fairly certain it was around the week he had spent 40 minutes explaining the entire structure of the Prime Minister's factional strategy to Shen Yuming, who had listened with genuine attention, and then said, with a precision that had stopped Long Ziyuan's breath briefly. So he's sacrificing the short-term policy to build the long-term alliance, which means the tax reform isn't actually about tax. It's about isolating Minister Chen's faction. At some point it had become visible. Not to everyone, but to the people who were paid to see things. Chief Eunuch Tan knew. He had known for some time. He held this knowledge with the professional care of a man who understood that his job was to ensure the emperor's well-being, and that, of all the things that had changed in the emperor's demeanor in the past 6 months, the specific quality of lightness visible on days when His Majesty had visited the Liking Palace was measurable. Tan had a word for it privately, released, as if something that was always under tension in the emperor had, in that garden, access to release. The Prime Minister's faction knew, in the more hostile sense that political adversaries sense threatening changes. Someone the emperor found interesting was someone who could have influence, and influence unmonitored was influence that could be deployed against them. This was the logic of the court, automatic as breathing. A formal petition arrived on Long Ziyuan's desk. The noble consort, having been installed in the Liking Palace for 2 years without producing any issue, should be formally reviewed under harem regulations regarding the status of consorts who had not. Long Ziyuan read it once. He set it aside. He picked up his brush and wrote 3 words at the bottom, which was his version of an annotation, and sent it back. The 3 words were, "Petition dismissed, Z." The petition was withdrawn within the hour. Chief Eunuch Tan, who had witnessed this, permitted himself a small internal satisfaction that he would deny if pressed. On the same day the petition was dismissed, Jisoo was in the kitchen arguing about soup. It was a productive argument. Chef Wu maintained that the traditional preparation of lion's head meatball soup required at minimum 3 hours of simmering, and Jisoo maintained that he had read a technique in one of the southern provincial texts involving a specific high-heat then low-heat sequence that could achieve comparable depth in 90 minutes. And they were both right in different ways, which meant the argument had the enjoyable quality of 2 people who respected each other disagreeing about something with no actual stakes. "If Your Highness insists on this technique," Chef Wu said, with the dignity of a man who had cooked for the imperial household for 20 years and was not going to be outmaneuvered by a noble consort's reading comprehension, "then this humble chef requires Your Highness to explain the 3rd step again. You add the aromatics before the initial high heat, not after. This is unorthodox." "Yes, that's the point. Your Highness." It was Xiaobai at the kitchen door, with an expression that suggested news. "His Majesty has dismissed the petition," Xiaobai said. Jisoo looked at him. He knew about the petition, Steward Liu had told him, very carefully, using diplomatic language that nonetheless conveyed exactly what was happening. He had decided not to worry about it, partly because he trusted Long Ziyuan's general competence, and partly because one of the genuine luxuries of his situation was that he was not required to perform anxiety. "Good," he said. He wrote "dismissed" himself, "Your Highness," 3 characters, and sent it back within minutes of receiving it. Jisoo thought about this. He thought about Long Ziyuan reading the petition, which had been written by people who wanted him gone, and spending approximately 3 characters on it. He thought about the fish, named after a minister. He thought about plum branches and dumplings and late afternoons and the specific quality of the emperor's laugh, which was rare and genuine, and which Jisoo had apparently been, privately, cataloging. "Thank you, Xiaobai," he said. He turned back to Chef Wu. "The aromatics go in first, let's try it." Chapter 10. Your Imperial Highness, I just want to eat. The plum trees peaked in the 3rd week of the 1st month, which meant the Liking Garden was, for approximately 10 days, genuinely extraordinary white blossoms against winter sky, the cold air carrying their faint sweetness, the fish moving through water that reflected petals. Long Ziyuan spent most of those 10 days finding reasons to visit in the afternoon. On the 5th day, he arrived to find Shen yumming in the hammock, which had been relocated to a position directly under the largest plum tree, lying with his arms behind his head looking up through the blossoms at the sky. He was not reading. He was not writing poetry. He was simply looking at the blossoms. Long Ziyuan stood at the edge of the pavilion and watched him for a moment without announcing himself. Shen yumming, without looking away from the blossoms, said, Your Majesty's entourage announced itself fairly loudly from the outer gate. I've been expecting you. You didn't come to receive me. I thought your Majesty could find his way. Long Ziyuan walked to the hammock. Shen Yuming looked up at him with the candid eyes of a person who had, over 6 months, become comfortable enough to be irreverent, which was, Long Ziyuan had been thinking about this, something that had not happened before in his life, not since he was a prince, and even then only rarely. Everyone performed in front of the emperor. Everyone was careful. Shen Yuming was careful, too, in the ways that mattered. He was never careless with Long Ziyuan's dignity, never exposed anything that should not be exposed. But he was not performing. He was simply present, in the direct and unhurried way of someone who had decided that the garden they were in was a space for actual things rather than theatrical ones. There's space, Shen Yuming said, shifting to demonstrate that the hammock, which was wide by design, had room for a second person. Long Ziyuan looked at the hammock. He looked at Chief Eunuch Tan, who was standing at the garden entrance with the expression of a man who has decided that whatever is about to happen is outside the scope of his documentation responsibilities. He looked at the plum tree. He looked at Shen Yuming, who was watching him with the calm patience of someone who had made an offer and was not going to repeat it. He sat on the edge of the hammock. It swayed, he gripped the side. It does that, Shen Yuming said helpfully. I can see that. You have to lean back and... I understand how hammocks work. Your Majesty was gripping the edge like it was a memorial he disagreed with. Long Ziyuan released the edge. He leaned back. The hammock settled under their combined weight, swaying gently, and the plum branches shifted overhead, releasing a small flurry of petals that drifted down through cold air. He was lying in a silk hammock in a palace garden next to the person he had been thinking about for 6 months, looking up through plum blossoms at a winter sky. He had meetings in 2 hours. The Ministry of Revenue was waiting for him. The Prime Minister's faction required attention. The Northwest Border Dispatch had arrived this morning and needed a response by evening. He looked at the plum blossoms. What are you thinking about? He asked. Honestly, yes. Whether Chef Wu will agree to try the lion's head soup with the 90-minute technique tonight, or whether I need to bring him the specific text as evidence. A pause. You were lying in a hammock under blooming plum trees, thinking about soup. The soup argument is ongoing. It has been 3 weeks. I need a resolution. Long Ziyuan turned his head to look at Shen Yuming. Shen Yuming, who had also turned his head, was very close. Hammocks were not large. And looking back at him with the same direct, uncomplicated honesty that had been the first thing Long Ziyuan had found genuinely startling about him. No performance. No calculation. Just himself in a garden, thinking about soup, somehow the most interesting person Long Ziyuan had encountered in 12 years of rule. I want, Long Ziyuan started and stopped, because the sentence had multiple possible endings and he needed to choose the right one. What does your Majesty want? Shen Yuming asked, with a gentleness that made the formal address sound almost fond. Long Ziyuan looked at the plum blossoms for a moment. Then he looked back. More of this, he said, more afternoons. Shen Yuming was quiet for a beat. Then you can have them, they're here. And you? Another beat shorter. Also here, Shen Yuming said, also quite willing to stay. The hammock swayed gently. A plum petal landed on Long Ziyuan's sleeve. Neither of them moved to brush it off. Stay for dinner, said Shen Yuming. If the soup works, it'll be worth it. If it doesn't, I'll be unbearable company, and your Majesty will never have to pretend to agree with Chef Wu's position out of politeness. I am never polite about food I disagree with. Excellent, then you'll be a useful third opinion. Long Ziyuan stayed for dinner. The soup took 92 minutes and was, by any measure, correct. Chef Wu received the news with the expression of a man who has lost an argument he's glad to have lost. Long Ziyuan ate 2 bowls, which was, Zairab told the kitchen staff afterward in a hushed and reverent tone, the most the emperor had ever eaten in the Liking Palace. Jisoo ate 3, because he had been waiting 3 weeks for this, and he was not going to be restrained about it, and watched Long Ziyuan's face over his bowl with the warm, private satisfaction of a man who had, accidentally and very completely, built something he hadn't planned to build at all. In the novel Thorns of the Dragon Throne, the emperor fell for Wei Shufeng after a dramatic confrontation in the throne room, followed by a rescue, followed by a moon-gazing scene that ran 40 pages. In the Liking Palace, an emperor fell into a hammock uninvited and was convinced to stay for soup, and it was, by any measure, a better story. The lion's head soup was perfect, the fish pond was full, the plum trees were at their peak. Nobody was sad about anything. Later, much later, when court historians attempted to document the turning point of the Emperor Long Ziyuan's 12th year of reign, the year that preceded the great political reforms, the resolution of the Northwest question, and what later scholars described as a notable softening in imperial temperament, they found themselves stymied by the absence of any dramatic event. No battle, no political crisis resolved by love, no moon-gazing scene. There was only a fish pond, a hammock, a kitchen that had been given permission to experiment, and a noble consort who had transmigrated into a novel looking for nothing more than a quiet life, and had, in the course of finding it, accidentally given the emperor something he hadn't known he was looking for either. Chief Eunuch Tan recorded it in his private journals as follows. His Majesty stayed for dinner at the Liking Palace for the first time today. He returned to his own chambers past the evening hour in what this servant will describe only as a good mood. The fish pond has 4 new residents. The noble consort has named them, Prime Minister Zhao, Minister Chen, the left censor, and one that he simply called the round one. I haven't decided yet. His Majesty expressed an interest in naming the 5th fish himself, when one becomes available. This servant notes this as a development of some significance.